Hello, and welcome to Swedenborgian Online Community's Thursday book club and chat. We welcome you to your affirming interfaith community, hoping to uplift you wherever you are. Before we get going, let us just take a moment and take a deep breath, or three, honoring the native peoples of our land, connecting with our ancestors, with our family and community, in love and support, knowing that we are deeply cared for by the Great Spirit and that Great Spirit through all. Well, I hope you're as excited as I am today to be heading towards the very end of our book club on heaven and hell. I'm not excited just to be over. I'm just excited about our content. I hope you are too. In fact, the last session, which will be in a couple weeks from now, will be almost primarily focused on hell. But we're not quite making it there today. The section we are in today is called The World of Spirits and Our State After Death. And I hope you had a chance to read it, but if not, no problem. If you want to read it and don't have a copy, you can find a free copy, hopefully near wherever you're hearing this or watching this, but also you can head over to swedenborgiancommunity.org/worship or /explore if you want to look at a few other books by Swedenborg as well, all free to download and read at your convenience. In fact, I've designed these talks so that you don't have to read if you don't want to. I try to hit all the major points or what I view as important. But there's a lot of beautiful details in Emanuel Swedenborg's book, so I invite you to read them. Emanuel Swedenborg, you probably know, is the 18th century mystical theologian who spent most of his career as a scientist, making many breakthroughs. It's kind of crazy, actually. If you look up nebular hypothesis on Wikipedia, you'll see that he's credited with that idea. It used to be credited to Laplace and Kant, but it turns out he had published it 30 years before, and of course Kant read a lot of Swedenborg. And it doesn't end there. I don't need to list them here. We're here to talk about heaven and hell. So the first section of the book we're reading from and talking about is 421. And so I'll give you a second to find that as I greet all of you in the chat. See, hello folks, nice to see you there. So this section is about what the world of spirits is. And generally it's a place between heaven and hell. And when we die, a lot of our processing happens there, according to Swedenborg. And we either process towards goodness and truth or towards evil and falsity. And it depends on our heart, which we'll cover in depth later. Now, truths are used to reform our hearts. So it takes some wisdom to learn and to grow. But we are generally born into a selfish orientation, according to Swedenborg. I don't know if you met a lot of 3-year-olds, but they do seem quite selfish, although we usually attribute innocence and beauty and love to them because they have all those things. I guess that kind of makes sense. But to the extent that we intend to do truths, we have heaven within us, no matter our age. And it's really those things that make the core of heaven in Swedenborg's landscape. He actually doesn't care or didn't think you had to believe in a certain religion in this world to have connection with heaven and to go to heaven in the next. He thought it was more about orienting your heart towards goodness and love and being willing to shed your destructiveness and shed your self-orientation as your supreme love. So he talks quite a bit about how the Lord and this spiritual realm doesn't allow people to have a divided mind in the next world. So you can't be partly oriented towards goodness but use a lot of truth, or partly oriented toward evil and use a lot of truth. You can't misuse truth for evil. You can be mixed between oriented towards evil and goodness, and so partly in both ways in this life, but in the next you have to essentially choose and accept your deeper loves, and you will, just based on the environment and the type of processing and connections that you have there. So some, though, it takes a while for them to process through their dividedness between heaven and hell, and so they'll stay in the world of spirits where a lot of processing occurs for weeks or even years. And people who knew each other in this life often are in this realm and recognize each other. And I kind of relate that to near-death experiences where people will pass over and say that they see their loved ones there. Sometimes more beatific than before, and we'll get to that later. But they'll recognize people. And you would think, okay, this is the afterlife. It's probably a huge place. How do these people run into each other? Well, if you're similar at heart and if you're connected, you tend to automatically do so because it's kind of quantum spiritual environment. It's the more connected in love you are, the closer you often are. But over time, according to Swedenborg, as we enter heaven or hell or are being processed or growing towards one, we change. Our spiritual bodies change. People may not recognize us in the same way anymore because we tend to relate to people through their outer manifestation, even if it's their outer spiritual nature, their outer habits, how they talk, all those things. And I think that's kind of interesting. It makes sense. It reminds me of a video game, just to nerd some people out and and get them to stop listening. There's a video game called Fable where as you make decisions, you either grow more heavenly, angelic, or hellish. You grow horns and flies start following you around based on your decisions in the game. I always thought it had a weird, parallel nature to Emanuel Swedenborg's writings. Although I was into that game before I found Swedenborg, so who knows where it's sourced from in me. Interestingly, Swedenborg describes how a breath of air from heaven can cause an evil spirit to scream in torment, but a breath from their hell has no such effect. And I think this connects back to what we were talking about in earlier sessions, where heaven isn't just a huge party that you would enjoy if you got in, if you got past the bouncers, if you tricked your way in. Why not just let everyone into heaven? Heaven is a spiritual state of infinite variety, but all oriented towards goodness and love and wisdom. And that state kind of determines the atmosphere there, because it's a spiritual atmosphere. And yes, there's ground and buildings and clothing, as we talked about, according to Swedenborg. So if you're not oriented in that state, the atmosphere is not right for you. And if you're hellish, a heavenly breath can freak you out, apparently. I thought that was an interesting aside, but a good way to review from Swedenborg. And he says, like the world of spirits, we each have two doors in us as well. One oriented towards evil and falsity, and the other oriented towards goodness and wisdom. And we make decisions, and our affections are influenced by which of these doors we choose to open. Our minds are at the intersection of these two paths, to these two places, he says, and to the extent that light from heaven is let in, we're rational. Our minds are rational. And with that, that is our first section. What a breeze, right? Hope it's not too fast for you. If you're listening on YouTube, you can slow the video down or speed it up, depending on your propensity for listening. And I just want to take a second at that milestone to connect with you all in the chat seat. Yes, hello again, Paige. You just returned from the great winter intensive at the Swedenborgian School for Religion, or now called Center for Swedenborgian Studies, on Swedenborgian spirituality. Tell us, what was that about, Paige? That, if you don't know, was one of the seminaries I attended in order to get the designation, the degrees, and etc. I needed for my ministerial position within this denomination. It's cool that you made it out there. I missed those classes. Please tell us what that was like. Yes, and good evening, Albert, Bill, Alyssa, as well. And Paige says, I'm just here for a bit. She's pretty wiped out from the time away. She'll just listen. Well, please settle in and get comfortable and share if you happen to feel compelled to. So our next section is each of us is inwardly a spirit. So all life, according to Swedenborg, and he talks about this in other places, so I wanted to include this here, is attributable to spirit. And no life is attributed to matter, really. Matter itself is, in a sense, an effect of the spiritual realm. And so, in a sense, all things are connected to the spirit, but human beings especially, beings that can reflect and connect to God through their conscience and their wisdom, have almost like an added layer of spirituality to them. Kind of like how he talks about heaven is in 3 levels in a sense, not based on who's Swedenborgian or not. No, Swedenborg wasn't a fan of that word, by the way. No, based on whether you're loving at heart, if you love and want to uplift it, or if you're more truth-oriented, or if you're more externally oriented. But you can be heavenly in each of those ways. And maybe as you grow, you go deeper within each, maybe to the next, or they're each within each other. In fact, he says they give rise to each other, almost like the spiritual realm gives rise to the physical. So kind of like the external heaven gives rise to the physical. And he says we each could not think or intend if there was no substantial agent as the source and focal point of thought and intent. And that focal point is spirit, from the Great Spirit. In fact, all our strength, all our goodness, all the things that work for us is from the Divine One. And so earlier he talked quite a bit about how angels are very certain and very clear that you can't attribute anything to them. And angels for Swedenborg, if you think that that's kind of hokey, are just dead people. So maybe that's less hokey for you. For him, all angels in heaven are people who've passed, aliens who've passed. Swedenborg was a big believer. In fact, he said he met many aliens in the spirit. And human beings, in the most general sense, including all aliens, and you'll see why in a second, have an inmost nature that animals do not. A nature into which the divine flows and which it raises toward itself. So the divine raises toward herself, uniting us to himself. So God is kind of like a giant spiritual sun, hopes to pull us in gravitationally, but only does so to the extent we won't burn up, which is nice. I guess that's the blessing of a smart, very, very smart sun. And all beings receive what we would call humanity, their humaneness, maybe more clearly, from divinity. And we can think about God, spirit, and matters of heaven and the church being humans, as well as each of our spiritual well-beings, whereas animals don't. I find it an interesting stance from Swedenborg that he says animals don't have this inner nature. You may not agree. It's something I mull over. It's interesting. Swedenborg saw all these beings in the spirit. And of course he saw animals there and he saw nature there. And, I'm curious. I'm always curious how much his connecting that spirit to the natural plane, like, okay, all animals here don't have this reflection, just goes to the fact that he couldn't see that, in the natural plane. Who knows? Swedenborg has had much experience that we are spirits, though. And speaking to, and he spoke to many over the years. In fact, it was in his, and I could get these years wrong because I didn't check this, but he was in his 50s when he first started having spiritual visions. And then he died in his early 80s, and he had them that entire time. And it took him a while to publish books on it. In fact, he was publishing a lot of scientific books year after year, and then those stopped because all of a sudden some crazy mystical stuff started happening. And although we are in the world, according to Swedenborg, each of us is in a community with spirits, even now. And that community is in heaven or hell. And I thought that was interesting. I kind of forgot that we're connected to a specific hellish or a specific heavenly community in this world. Although he also talks, according to him, but he also talks about how that changes over time. And that we're also connected to spirits from heaven and hell at the same time, all the time in this life. So, we may have a home community in the spiritual realm, but we still have these kind of cross bridges between the two. And in fact, we find that equilibrium in the world of spirits, which is deeply connected to this realm and our lives in this realm as well. And but he does say we're not visible as spirits in those communities unless we're deep in like spiritual meditation. And he says even then the spirits who see us know that we're not really quite there because we walk around without paying attention to anything and with our eyes like cast down or closed or something. So I thought that was interesting as well. And our next section is called Our Revival from the Dead and Entry into Eternal Life. So this is when we wake up from that spiritual slumber, in a sense. We're no longer dazed and walking around. In fact, we tend to wake up in the world of spirits, and we're quite fascinated often that there is an afterlife, at least the people from this planet are. And he says that the essential person in each of us is always still alive, even after what we call death. And before I continue there, I just want to reconnect with you all in the chatsie. And Paige says the intensive this year was at Timonos Retreat Center. Oh, I heard that. That's great. I'm very jealous. Although I'm trying to shed my jealousy, of course. And Timonos is this, what I hear is a wonderful retreat center in Westchester, and it in the States, in Pennsylvania. And it's a Swedenborgian run retreat center. Oh, that's cool. What was that like there, Paige? And she says, Christine Campbell gave a great and very practical session on music in the church. I will get the materials and send them to me, Cory. Great, thank you, Paige. That would be fantastic. So it's interesting that Swedenborg goes very in depth about how our bodies are connected to the spiritual realm. I find it kind of illuminating. So he says our breathing and our heartbeat and all our vital processes which depend on them are in a deep connection with the spiritual realm. So specifically our heartbeat and our breathing. And of course he says these things come from a certain part of the brain. I think he had very monumental research in terms of how the brain works and where certain things are sourced from in the brain. But he says these, of course, all that stuff has a deep connection with the spiritual realm. And when those two motions in our bodies cease, there's an immediate separation between our spirit and our body. And the reason I find this so fascinating is because, often in near-death experiences, people don't leave their body until their heart stops. So your breathing may stop, and then your heart stops, and they leave their body. Or, of course, if you don't come back from that, it's considered death medically. Although if you come back from that, it's no longer called death, it's just cardiac arrest, which is interesting. But people tend to have these experiences out of body when this happens. And some people see the spiritual realm, which is strangely similar to Swedenborg's visions, or like their room, they overhear conversations. You can read about near-death experiences with a quick Google search. And he says spirits and angels attend to us as we die, but we are ultimately awakened by the Lord. And I find that interesting because in near-death experiences, people often say they see beings of light, sharing love, that are welcoming them or sharing, message with them. And of course they see their families and friends eventually in a lot of those visions. Swedenborg shares also that when he was in a simulation of this awakening for himself, so he was going through this process, a covering from his left eye seemed to be rolled back toward the center, and he started seeing a clear but dim light, and that this appearance represents that we are moving from natural thinking to spiritual thinking. Well, you may think that's a weird detail for me to include, but it's actually the source of a very popular Swedenborgian YouTube channel called Off the Left Eye, that's done by the Swedenborg Foundation. So for full disclosure, I'm on the board of the Swedenborg Foundation. And, they got that name from this section specifically. So I find that really cool. So it represents us moving from our natural thinking to spiritual thinking. I think that's beautiful. And angels who help us wake up apparently don't leave us, but we do leave them, which I thought was fascinating. So they wouldn't leave us, they want to keep helping us, but often we're like, got other things to do. maybe it's something else, but he says we leave them, they don't leave us. And it typically takes 3 days before a full awakening happens. Yeah, I can see how that connects to the resurrection of Christ as well. And people tend to be embarrassed that they didn't know that we actually live after death. Although those who are set against truths ultimately reject the truths of life, even in the spiritual realm. And he didn't mention it here, but I connect that to some people eventually saying, you know what, I never died. This has always been what's going on. Stop pulling my chain. So I find that kind of interesting that even in the next life, eventually you may be like, you know what, that's all false. That's all. What's the popular term now? Fake news. It's all fake news. I've always been spirit. What's this material body you speak of? But as we'll see in a few moments, our natural memories are actually dormant and can be brought out. So if the Lord wants, and it's necessary or wanted or needed, each spirit can have his natural or her natural memory brought out to maybe help them realize, okay, this is something else. There's more going on here than what I'm saying. And our next section is called After Death, We Are in a Complete Human Form. So we already covered that every angel is in a perfect human form. Human being divine in a sense, being coming from the divine. And that even the form of a human body, or even the form of all things, in a way has to represent divinity, especially if we're not talking about a destructive process here. And so I find that fascinating. And of course our spirits are even more so because they receive divine goodness and wisdom. And in this next life, we have a body. So not only are we in the form spiritually, but we'll see that form spiritually. And we'll be able to see other people, see other things, hear and interact with our spouse, with our friends, etc. And ultimately, this is because humanity has evolved in the form of heaven, which is why we can receive all these things. In fact, in a sense, all life comes from God and heaven. And so even if we're focusing on like evolution here, to the extent we believe it's the most living things live, the most things that can work in community the best, that can leverage its environment, that tendency towards life is a tendency towards receiving heaven, because that's what allows for all structure in general. Looks like I've lost connection, so let me see. I have a backup here. Can you all hear me? I hope you can. So, if my backup's working, I'll keep going and I'll check in to see if you're hearing me. So, we've evolved in the form of heaven, and when we first enter the world of spirits, we still kind of have the trappings of our material life, our material bodies in a sense, because our face, our voice has a similar appearance because we're still oriented towards similar things as we are in the natural world. We remember ourselves, we remember our natural disposition and outlook, but over time that tends to fade. Our natural memories tend to fade, and our deeper concerns, our deeper reality is uncovered and kind of let loose in a sense. And so our appearance, which mimics that, according to Swedenborg, in the spiritual realm, starts to change drastically. Now, people engaged in goodness have beautiful faces, and those engaged in evil have repulsive ones in the spiritual realm, according to Swedenborg. And the more we grow towards heaven in our own way, the more we receive our own type of beauty. And I think today it's kind of a popular trend to say no one is ugly, right? And no one really is, in a sense, in this material realm. But one thing we could probably say is ugly is really repulsive behavior, really repulsive outlooks. And so I think that it actually fits that he's using these terms for these types of faces that aren't this type of face, material faces, but our spiritual face, like what we're about. And then the more we are forms of heavenly love in terms of what we're about, the more beautiful we become in heaven. And with those who love divine truth more outwardly, but are still heavenly, they're beautiful but less. They're less lovely. I love that he goes through a bunch of steps of like, okay, this is less lovely. But I think he's reiterating our hearts need to be connected to love, and we need to be growing towards caring about wisdom, caring about truth, and ultimately caring about people and divine qualities in other people. It's good motivation, right? You get prettier the more loving you are. If only that worked in this life, right? Well, maybe not. Everything's this way for a reason, I'm sure. Swedenborg has seen faces of angels so beautiful that no artist could imagine it. That makes sense if it's a transcendent realm. Many of you may relate if you've taken hallucinogenic drug. You probably couldn't recreate it very well on paper, although artists like Alex Gray sure do try. And everything good and true that comes from the Lord and makes heaven is in a human form, in Swedenborg's use of human. And he calls this, well, I'll call this a hologram. So everything is kind of in this hologram of divinity, although we're in kind of finite form of that hologram. But even the things that make up us, from the cells, the atoms, all the physics involved, each of those things is in this form as well, in a strange way. He says most of us can't understand that in this life. He actually says this, but it's very clear to angels that everything is in the human form. Okay, and I just want to make sure you all can hear me. Okay, good. Yes, I lost my internet connection, but I always have my backup phone, so that's how the people on the podcast are hearing us. And our next section is after death. We enjoy every sense, memory, thought, and affection we had in the world. We leave nothing behind except our earthly body. Before I get into it, I will mention we will not make it through all the readings tonight. I left the final two sections for our final session, which is mainly centered on the last part of the book, which is hell. But I thought it was nice to keep a little more heavenly stuff at the beginning of that one. And also, hell only is like 65 numbers. He numbers different sections in his writing. And that's not very much compared to some of these earlier talks. So kind of push that off to the last time, and that'll make this one a little more digestible tonight for those of you listening live. So we keep everything that pertains to our character in the next life. And even when we first enter our spiritual bodies, we perceive no difference from our earthly ones, as I mentioned. And we experience the same pleasures, those same pleasures of sense, our inner senses and our outer senses, he says, in that next life, but often in a more exquisite way, especially sight and hearing, he emphasizes. If we are in goodness or growing towards goodness and accepting it. But for evil spirits who are attracted to falsity, they like to distort things because in a sense it's their food, it's their form. If they love evil, to the extent you love evil, you love falsity that can kind of help it along in a sense. Their senses are actually, they abound with imperfection. So that's unfortunate, but I guess it works for their purposes. This, in a way, this sounds like ableist almost, because he's saying, okay, you have all your senses. And some people in this life do not have those senses. In fact, he'd say you have hands and feet, and etc. And of course, some people in this life or in the material realm don't. And I think this kind of goes to the fact that he tends to generalize, and of course, he's not talking about every alien out there when he says, if he ever says two hands, right? He's just kind of generalizing the human beings on this planet. I also think it connects to the idea that he thinks, okay, you'll see even if you're blind in this life. You'll see light in a spiritual way because you already do. So for him, you could be blind on the material plane, but you're not blind on the spiritual plane. He would say if you're blind on the spiritual plane, you have no rational thinking because it's the light of spirit, spiritual light, that allows for thinking and wisdom. So he says, okay, well, you can keep your differences if you want in the material plane, and you can keep all your senses in the spiritual plane, but you're going to have senses that you may not think you have in the material plane in the spiritual. That's me trying to be somewhat prudent about people aware of ableism. I hope I'm not furthering it in any way. And our natural thoughts become dormant since in the next life because no natural objects can be reproduced there. And so our thoughts that connect to natural objects fade away. Our memories kind of fade away because they're not being lit up. They're not connecting. And of course, we don't have our bodies in that way, but we have kind of a deep spiritual memory of our natural lives. But he says they can be reproduced when it pleases God, as I mentioned before. And he says this can happen for a lot of reasons. It can be because you're refusing to accept that you've been doing certain evil things to people. Maybe your memory can be revealed because of that. But it could range as to why. But it's chosen to happen by the Lord if your memories are going to be revealed. Although angels can also look at you and look at every part of you and see your life, even to small details, according to Swedenborg. But angels, of course, receive all of their ability and strength from divinity. And this is what it means when the biblical scripture talks about the book of life. And Quran also talks about a book of life being read. And Swedenborg relates it to, especially in Revelation where it mentions the book of life. This is what this means. You can have your book of life read in the next life. So I find that fascinating. And also, we can be considered especially wise or smart in this earthly plane. But if our minds don't accept rationality from heaven's light, then we'll eventually be backwards of thought in the spiritual realm. Since intelligence doesn't connect with goodness when we're oriented towards evil, it falls away in the spiritual realm because, as we mentioned before, you can't have a divided mind. And wisdom, intelligence, truth has its rightful connection to goodness. It's the form of goodness. And so, although we can kind of misuse it in this life, it falls away in the next. And also, it's not a natural plane, so the more our intelligence is oriented just to natural things for selfish purposes, the more it'll fade. And I find this kind of interesting. He paints this picture, and I hope you appreciate it. I'm going to read directly from Swedenborg just for a moment. He says, for people who have focused solely on memorization during their physical lives, without developing their rational ability, their memory has a calloused quality that looks hard and streaked with tendons inside. So if we're just focused on memorization, but not our rationality, our memory has a callous quality. I find that an interesting description. No wonder poets love Swedenborg, right? For people, this is him again, for people who have filled their memories with false notions, it looks shaggy because of the random mass of disorganized stuff. For people who have focused on memorization with themselves and the world first in mind, it looks stuck together and bony. For people who have tried to probe divine secrets through acquired information, especially philosophical information, without believing anything before they are convinced by the information, their memory looks dark with a quality that actually absorbs rays of light and turns them into darkness. For people who have been guileful and hypocrites, it looks bony and hard as ebony that reflects light rays. However, for people who have focused on the good of love and truths of faith, no such callous is visible. This is because their inner memory is transmitting rays of light into their outer memory, and those rays find definition in its objects or concepts as though it were their foundation or their soil, and find congenial vessels there. This is because the outer memory is the outmost element of the design, where spiritual and heavenly matters come gently to rest and dwell when there are good and true contents in it. Thank you, Swedenborg, if nothing else, for your scientific poetry. He also says spirits and angels have memory of their spiritual lives. So as we grow in the next life, we have a memory of what we're doing, even if our natural memory falls away. And through these, they are constantly developing their rational ability forever, because it takes memory to develop our rationality, according to Swedenborg. So hopefully we're doing the same thing, even in this life. And spirits retain the amount and kind of affection they had in the world. And these are perfected by being filled in. So he kind of says, in a sense, your deep affections don't change in the next life, once you die at least. This life is for forming that in a sense. But these things can be filled into infinity, which I find a fascinating thought. So this is why we must take our hearts seriously in this life. This is kind of a certain type of budding ground, I guess. And everything is capable of infinite variation, he says, and enrichment by different means. And so our goodness can be multiplied and can bear fruit towards infinity, as its source is the infinite. So he's saying it's not like you're not growing, but you are actually growing to infinity. You're being perfected to infinity. But you really have to take seriously the state of your heart in this life. Oh, hey, Robert. Thanks for joining us. Greetings. Let us know what your thoughts are, for all of you, about heaven and hell, which, of course, I'll remind you can download at swedenborgiancommunity.org/explore. And let me know if you have any questions or suggestions for future discussion groups, books, topics, what have you. We're always looking for more inspiration from you all. So the next section is called Our Nature After Death Depends on the Kind of Life We Led in the World. So heaven is not granted to anyone on the basis of mercy alone, according to Swedenborg. Many people today have this idea that, okay, I believed in Jesus, or I'll pray to Jesus right before I die, and I'll go to heaven. Swedenborg would say, well, it doesn't actually matter if you believe in a historical Jesus in this life. At least not to the extent that it matters what your heart is oriented towards. And is that goodness, is that love, and are you living it out? Because otherwise, you're kind of, you're pretending, you're faking yourself out. And so it has to do with your heart, the kind of life you lead. And that's not just your actions, and we'll touch on this in a second. So he says it does say in many places in the Word that we will be judged and requited according to our deeds and works. I love that word, requited. I should like to cite a few passages here. He says, quote, so this is a direct quote from him. He says, he quotes Matthew, Revelation, and many other sections of the Bible where it emphasizes you have to do good works, is often the way it says. So for example, Revelation 2:23, I will give to all according to the works. Matthew 16:17, the human-born one is come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and then he will render to everyone according to his or her works. So often in mainline Western Christianity, the emphasis is that's not on works. Are you kidding me? That's wrong. It's just about faith alone saves, accept Jesus as your Lord and Master. I grew up at a Baptist church in the Salvation Army, and we would talk about this concept and others, but it never quite made sense to me that you could say someone is your master but not actually do what they tell you to do. And that master often tells you how to feel and how to treat the downtrodden, and to do good and to repent from your evil. And so to get to the point where you call Jesus, Sophia, Krishna your master, you have to be living it out. You can be calling God that, but how often did Jesus call out people for just saying things and not meaning it in their heart? All the time. I mean, that's like all the fun parts, all the contentious parts of the New Testament, in a sense, all the interesting things around him. Okay, stop this fakeness on the outside, change your heart. And, it's quoted later, but you're like, Jesus in Christian Second Testament says, you are like white sepulchres. The outside of you is whitewashed, but the inside is full of bones. I mean, often that's what we tend to be if we say, okay, my religion is right, you're going to hell, and then we hurt people in our lives constantly and destroy. I mean, I think that's maybe even worse than the people he was calling that in Jesus' time, right? So we really have to be interested in our hearts and about the quality of Christ, the quality of divinity, and sussing that out. What is goodness? What is love? What is truth? What is wisdom? And then living it. So he quotes many different verses emphasizing you got to do it. You can't just have it in your head or think you're doing it. And I love this quote from Christ, from Matthew. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter into the kingdom of the heavens, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in the heavens will. Many people will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied through your name, and through your name cast out demons, and in your name done many powerful deeds?' But then I will confess to them, 'I do not recognize you. Get away from me, workers of iniquity.'" So I think it hits home, right? I think he says it. He doesn't recognize them because they're workers of iniquity. Who's he talking to? Talking to people who say, "Lord, Lord." So, we really have to reflect on ourselves and hold ourselves accountable to how we're receiving God. Moving on. All right. So works and deeds include our deeper nature. So it's not just our actions outwardly, and it's not just how they look at all, actually. Really, the heart of it is in your heart. So you have to be concerned about that. And love and volition is what makes us who we are, not just the thoughts that come into our head. And we constantly turn our spiritual face toward our dominant love, which determines what thoughts come into our head. And in the next life, we will, in a sense, literally turn our spiritual head towards our loves. And our loves want to be nourished by what is appropriate to them, and that's evil or good loves. And so good loves want to be nourished by truth, and evil loves are nourished by falsity. And everything of our character and spirit is in our works and deeds. And so everything of us is, in a sense, imprinted in everything we do. There's a little trimmer in every movement you make that connects to what you're really about, according to Swedenborg. And there is a dominant love that we each have. And they can change over time. That's kind of what salvation is, uplifting that dominant love within our hearts, according to Swedenborg, no matter our religion. And it remains with us after we die, and then it doesn't change after we die, according to him. Although it can become more perfect, it can be filled with goodness and actions in the spiritual realm. And he says a great deal of experience has convinced him of this. So, I know many people have issue with an eternal hell. And I think he says this maybe for a reason. He says a great deal of experience has convinced him of this. He's kind of leaving the door open to say, God could change this, maybe. God isn't about changing people's hearts or forcing them into goodness. According to Swedenborg, this universe is, standed and rooted in freedom That's what allows for creation, allows for finite beings receiving divinity, that we can turn away from that divinity in our actions and in our heart. That freedom has to be around. But God doesn't have to let everything happen. And she only lets things that serve a purpose besides that freedom as well. But maybe, who knows, maybe in the course of things, Swedenborg will be proven wrong in that regard, that people tend to stay in hell once they're in hell. And so our faith does not stay with us unless it comes from a heavenly love, and neither do its teachings. So you can be really steeped into spiritual stuff, but to the extent it's not really in your heart, it falls away. Yeah. Interesting. Makes sense, I think. Love in action, therefore our life, is what remains with us in the afterlife. Yeah, thank you, Robert. Robert shares, we keep evolving according to Tom Campbell. Yeah, Tom Campbell's a great thinker. Paige says it was inspiring to hear all the students and their visions for their call, and also about what they viewed as their growth edges. This is in reference, of course, to the class she was just in that I'm jealous about. And she says we have a great group of MDiv and licensed pastorate students. MDiv being Masters of Divinity students. Great. Yeah, they're wonderful. I miss connecting with those students and the beautiful professors and teachers out there. So happy that you're connecting with them. Bye, Bill. Understand you're tired. Get some rest. Blessings. So our next section is after death, the pleasures of everyone's life are turned into things that correspond. So think about it for a second before I get into this. What things would correspond to your pleasures? That's kind of a hard one. Like, what does that mean? So Swedenborg explores, this means, like, what kind of spiritual representation would represent what's going on in your heart and your head. And I think this is another place where poets really love Swedenborg. They're like, oh, everything affectional, everything, in the human spirit has form and shapes, and it's different for each person, and colors, and it's all kind of poetic, right? And that's often what poems are. They're kind of metaphors, beautiful metaphors for spiritual things, for life. So are the parables of Christ in Scripture. So what would that be for you? Maybe you can think of it as, what would your poem look like if you were reflecting on a specific source of pleasure in your life? What kind of objects would appear? Well, to illuminate this a little more, I'll mention that Swedenborg says our spiritual environments reflect our love. If we hate heavenly light, then our spirit may enjoy finding places in shade or deep darkness. So even like underground. It's interesting because often when we say hell, we're like out down there, right? And down in the caves. And the only light is from the lava down there, right? But Swedenborg, he doesn't say we're being tortured in hell in the same way as is often depicted. But he does say that people, in a spiritual way, if you think about it, if light is from God, and you don't want that wisdom, you want to misuse some, but you don't really want it shining on you, then you're going to be hiding all the time. And he says that's what evil spirits do. Interesting. He also says if we love dogma, but don't apply it to our lives, then we may like living among rocky piles. And cultivating land, like growing things, is repulsive to us. So I find that very poetic. Okay, I'm dogmatic. I don't really want to use it. I want to force it on others. I want to hurt people with it. In the spiritual realm, I don't like growing stuff. Like I don't like using the land around me to make life. Right? I could see how that connects to that standpoint. And he says if we primarily love spiritual filth, or spiritually filthy things in our hearts, then we will find ourselves loving filthy environments and filthy substances in the spiritual world because these things correspond. You're probably getting it now. It took me that part of this reading for it to illuminate to some degree for myself, or at least feel like it was. Also, if we love spiritual light, warmth, and the resulting life from that, so light, warmth, and the resulting life, then we may find ourselves in lush environments, clear homes, perhaps, surrounded by vineyards and harvest, and even those in a heavenly state with all these beautiful things. There's a lot of variation, as we've covered, and they may be on the side of a mountain, they may be on a hill, depending on their spiritual orientation. Each of these things has a deep connection to their heart. And in a heavenly state, you may look around, and not only is everything different, but it seems to you like every object seems to laugh and play and live. So everything's alive to you. And often children tend to look at the world that way. So it connects back to the innocence of being a child and a childish outlook. So our pleasures in heaven are largely indescribable, and they increase to eternity, especially for those who live in a chaste marriage love from their spiritual loves and regard adultery as unspeakable, according to Swedenborg. So sometimes he has these very general ideas, and then sometimes he's like, you know what, I got to focus on this one thing, very concrete in his thinking. You know, if you love adultery, it's not going to turn out very well for you, according to Swedenborg. But if you regard it as unspeakable, or you're working towards that, and you accept that, and you want to connect deeply in a marriage love, then you have a special, he talks about how that kind of love gives root to joy indescribable in a way that all these other heavenly things have joy and beauty, but not in such a deep, intense way. Oh, I think that is a nice motivation to look at our connections and maybe not hurt people by doing things that bring in harm. I think that can take many forms, but especially if you're in a committed relationship, adultery is very hurtful, and it tends to reveal something that I think many of us struggle with, which is a propensity towards lust and a type of selfishness, right? And so it makes sense that he would say that's hellish, because his definition of hellishness is selfishness surmounting all things and materialism surmounting all things, and a love of body for body's sake and for sleeping with everyone, no matter the cost, except for maybe your reputation and place in the world, is very, very selfish and hurtful if you're lying and cheating on someone. So our next section, which I'm going to bring into one, so it's 3 sections, are our 3 states after death. So our first state after death, which is outward concerns, and people still recognize this, as we talked about. Our second state after death is one of inward concerns, and we start to change our appearance, etc. And our third state after death, which is a state of instruction for people who are entering heaven. So it's a process of preparation as we head towards heaven. Is the third state. So he does mention that some people don't go through these states at all. They just immediately flying up to heaven, bam, or diving into hell, whoosh, whatever the right sound effect is. But that is very few. That's very, very few. And he says those who are immediately raised into heaven have been regenerated. It's a word he uses for salvation, in a sense, the work that the Lord does in our hearts, our spirits, our intentions, our actions, and they're prepared already in their earthly lives. And those who are profoundly malicious, on the other hand, but have worn a guise of goodness, are the ones that dive, or are, quote-unquote, cast directly into hell. So the first thing he talks about in this section of the first state is that often married partners meet in this state. And over time, many married partners find that they separate because their internal selves start to be revealed, which has to do with the second state, where our internal concerns become dominant. And as our internal selves are revealed, of course, secrets are revealed, etc., and maybe not a deep, close connection as we thought we had. And also, often in the first state, spirits will travel around, just getting to know the place, the world of spirits, and hear about things, learn about things, about that realm, about heaven, about hell, about God. Reminds me for some reason of that Robin Williams movie, what's it called? What Dreams May Come. Yeah. People often tell me that that's inspired by Swedenborgian thought, but I've never seen the references, so I can't agree. No, I'm kidding. I mean, it makes sense. It does make sense. And so, as we mentioned before, each spirit, even through this process, is still in a connection to a heavenly or hellish community, or communities primarily. But this is in regards to their deeper nature, and that doesn't reveal itself until they move through their first states. And in the second state, we are given, the one of inward concerns, we are given access and expression to the deeper reaches of our minds and intentions, and our more outward interests become dormant. So the outward things falling asleep, as we talked about, the inward things revealing themselves, that changes the way we look, changes what we do, changes how we talk. So if we acted good or pleasant just for outward reasons, reputation, hiding things, etc., these things fall away, folks, disappear. And this state of our deeper concerns reveals what kind of people we really are. And he doesn't put it this way here, but I remember, I think it was him putting it, what would you do if you could get away with it? that kind of reveals some part of your spirit. And so as you're processing, as you're growing, maybe reflect on that. Like, what could I do in certain situations, different different resources? If I could get away with it, what would I do? And then use that to say, okay, I need to grow in this way. That does not sound like it's very heavenly. It doesn't sound good. It doesn't seem supportive of others. Let me receive a little more help from God. Let me find practices, find wisdom that helps me to grow and change. So I think a good encapsulation of this is what Jesus said in Matthew, according to biblical scripture, to hypocrites. You are like whitewashed sepulchres, as I mentioned, that look lovely on the outside, but are inwardly full of the bones of the dead and all uncleanness. Yeah, I just love that one. I had to read it again. And all people who lived lives focused on what is good, on the other hand, and have acted in accord with their conscience, seem to awake from sleep when they enter this second state of inward concerns. So you may be really sharp right now. You may have a good spiritual bent. You may not call it that. You may just have a good conscience, good heart. As you're finding yourself in this next life and the second state comes upon you, it almost seems like you wake up even more. You were relatively asleep before. And I think this really connects to popular terminology today, like become woke, right? And of course, there are a lot of wakefulness philosophers in history. Many Swedenborgians are attracted to the writings of Gurdjieff, who is a wokefulness philosopher of the early 20th century. Moreover, as we wake up in the second state, we act more from heaven's light and access a deeper wisdom and affection. So we may have seemed simple to people before. If you have a good heart, often people do. But in this process, before we even get to heaven, we're receiving this deeper wisdom, this greater affection through this shedding of state. And they also feel profound blessedness and pleasure that they have never known before. So Swedenborg often repeats that you may be connected to heaven now, but usually it only shows up in a sense of peace or calm, in this kind of feeling of slight blessedness. But it's not until the afterlife, or when our spiritual eyes are awoken, that we start really feeling the beginning of how great it is. And this is when they all acknowledge divinity and worship her in freedom. So we may call God different things, etc., but it's in this state where our inward concerns are being revealed, that it's kind of revealed to us because our internal orientation towards goodness, whatever we call that divinity, that personhood, it's coming out, and it's open. No matter whatever words we use before, we're in a spiritual realm and light, spiritual language, and we won't have a problem saying, okay, looks like we're pointing towards the same God here, the same divinity. And I think That's really profound and touching. However, those focus on evil in our lives, in their lives, even if they say and believe that they worship God, find that they do not acknowledge him or her, and that they deny their real presence, God's real presence, even if they think they believe in God in this life. They also start to act out in ways they would have never done in public before, in accord with their inner nature. Of course, this is all according to Swedenborg. You can take it with a grain of salt. He's just a gentleman from the 18th century. However, the Lord controls the madness of these people who end up in these states and acting out with their inner nature, so that they don't transgress the bounds of usefulness. As we mentioned, even though God allows for freedom and evil to appear, that evil has to serve some purpose, even beyond that freedom that God has to allow for creation. And evil, and wants to allow, because it's a deep intrinsic reality to divinity. And evil people serve to teach the good, for example, and they also collect other evil people to them, to remove them from the good, and to prepare them for hell. He doesn't go into that very much, but kind of useful insight there. And there are punishments in the spiritual world in reaction to evil deeds there, to help keep the peace and to mitigate the torment of those around them. So there are punishments to keep the peace, and also because every evil brings its own punishment with it. So there's punishment for purpose, but it can't be helped. Evil comes with the punishment because it's rejecting God. It's creating a distortion that has to be righted, in a sense. But none are punished for what they did in the world, according to Swedenborg. Only what they continue to do in the spiritual realm. And I think that is wonderful. Who knew that God would be the most woke of all? Only fear of punishment helps to mitigate their acting out. And that's why this punishment is allowed as well. And good spirits are never punished, as their worldly evils don't come back in the spiritual realm. I didn't remember that. That was fascinating to me, that, if you die and your heart's good, you go through this first state, you enter the second state, you're not punished because those evils aren't coming up anymore, because we're getting to the heart of who you are. And good and evil spirits are eventually separated, even in the world of spirits. So they don't just stay mixed and evil spirits hurting good spirits in the world of spirits. They start getting separated as these things start happening. With that, I want to take a moment and just connect with you folks. And also I want to remind you to call in anytime that we're live at 646-564-9571 and share your voice in that way. We'd love to have you and love your perspective. So in the chat-see, Robert is sharing, only can we advance in the afterlife when our angels, relatives there, see we try to do good and evolve. The overall consciousness system is just trying to evolve through us, in parentheses. In the heart of the religion in the Gospel of Thomas, which is I believe is what's that Christian line of thinking? I'll get back to it. In the Gospel of Thomas, it's to find Christ consciousness in our hearts. And good night, Albert. See, I missed a lot of the shows. I was handling a challenge. Oh, that's too bad. And then lastly, Robert shares a link to a video that he says is a cool reflection on the meaning of Christianity through Egypt. And the name of the video, for those of you curious, is James Phillips, Pharaoh, Akhenaten, and the Sacred Wisdom of Ancient Egypt. I'll have to check that out later. Thank you so much, Robert. So further, back to heaven and hell. I wish I could show you a copy, but I tend to give them away. Spirits in this process are eventually shown the heavenly or hellish community they were primarily living and connected with in their earthly life. Probably primarily living and connected with in their earthly life. And particularly where they are currently heading. So you're eventually shown, that's the place you're going. Like you keep looking over there, you're walking that way. I want to show you what's going on. That's cool. And only those being prepared for and heading toward heaven enter the third state after death. Oh, so the one of instruction, of preparedness, only happens for those being prepared for heaven, because the others refuse to learn, apparently. And so their second state is also their state before entering hell. It just continues. And so a third state, instruction, is necessary to enter heaven, since angels we literally form into angelic beings by knowing what is good and true, to the extent we can receive those things, as well as what is evil and false, and truly moving beyond our any evil and falsity we had in the world. And one such teaching is that God exists, according to Swedenborg. We may take umbrage at his language, but I bet you could agree goodness exists, maybe, or maybe not. And heaven and hell exist. I think by this point you would probably know that God, but hopefully you would know, that God and her qualities are to be loved above all, and our neighbors as ourselves, and that divine scripture should be believed and embodied to the extent that they are from the divine. So scripture being in all its forms, because it shows up in different communities in different ways, according to Swedenborg earlier in this book. We should be looking at those in this life, in the next life, and really embodying and believing it to the extent it's divine, to the extent we can see that it's divine. And I'm sure if we're being instructed by angels in the next life, they'll have a good sense as to which are, and I'm sure we'll find the ones that fit us the best. Also, our propensity to learn comes from the Lord in general. So we're already in connection to the Lord, being willing to learn. And then the Lord flows into our life as she teaches us and kindles our loving intentions. So God is really the source of this life. And to the extent that this happens, our deeper reaches are opened and heaven is sown in them. So our deeper reaches of our minds, of our hearts are opened to the extent we allow the Lord to flow into our life and teach and kindle our good, loving intentions. At the same time, our moral and fair deeds in this life become spiritually good if we're going through this kind of process on our own. Well, not on our own in spiritual community, but in this reality, they become spiritually good because we start to do them for the sake of divinity. So there's a new life to even maybe the normal things that we thought were good, or our moral goodness, or our civic goodness. On the other hand, some have convinced themselves deeply of false principles, but they've lived good lives. And if they pass before they can enter heaven, these falsities must be shed in order for truths to be seen by these people, and then they can enter heavenly life. Now, he doesn't list out, all the false principles out there, but he says, we'll shed them as we're entering heaven. Further, people are taught in different ways depending on their character and their background. Makes sense. Maybe, I'm sure they have wonderful teachers coming out of heaven, right? And teaching is different in heaven than on earth, as information is not consigned to memory, but to life, since spiritual memory is in our lives and we cannot absorb or accept that which doesn't agree with our lives if we're spirits and angels. So our memory is literally in our living, in terms of this type of teaching and information. When we are being prepared for heaven, we absorb information that's useful for our lives and fits with our affection, because that feeds us, and that gives us nourishment, and that's what we yearn for, is truths, information that we can use for our lives. And once we're prepared for heaven, so this is all wrapping up, we are put into new clothing and turned over to guardian angels, according to Swedenborg. Then we are accepted by other angels and put in touch with their communities with a host of blessings that come along with that. So people in heaven, angels as they're called, welcome us, and we become angelic, I'm assuming, in a second, and we're put in touch with our heavenly communities, and they bless us, they give us gifts. Then the Lord takes each angel to their community, where they are recognized instantly and accepted with joy. So that's interesting. You're connected with your community, with your guardian angels near you, and you're accepted there. Blessings come your way, and then the Lord takes you there. And once you're there, you are recognized instantly and accepted with joy. Wow. Well, that wraps up our highlights this evening, our summaries of these sections. We are heading towards the end, folks. The only final part of this book we have left is on hell for the most part. We have 2 sections before hell, which will put us in a nice peaceful tone before we dive deep. But it is fascinating that hell is such a small part of this book. I think that's probably good, that heaven and hell is really just heaven. All right. So we'll cover that in our last section. But before we wrap up, I want to reconnect with you in the chat scene. Even if you're not catching this live, though, I want to highlight that you can reach out to us in email. You can get to our email on our website, Swedenborgiancommunity.org. You can reach out to us in the Chatsy at any time. You may log in and be like, oh, no one's here. But you can comment things, you can share things, and you can find our Chatsy at Swedenborgiancommunity.org/worship. It's like a chat box under one of the recent broadcasts. You do need a Chatsy account, so sorry about that. But it's not hard. And you can comment there. And you can also comment in YouTube or wherever you find us on Facebook. You can message us on Facebook. You can message us on Instagram as well. You can share your thoughts, uplift them, and I'll try my best to reconnect with you and uplift them as well if that's what you're wanting. And please connect with us. If you head to our website, there are some areas where you can cross-connect, but people haven't been on those, like their discussion forums, for a while, so they're kind of hidden. If you want the discussion forums back, let me know that too, and we will connect in that way. Robert shares in the Chatsy, our spirit's eternal home is heaven, and this world hides all that from us so we don't get overwhelmed. Robert also says Hinduism calls this world Maya, which means an illusion. Yeah, so our eternal home is heaven, you're saying. And this is a place for processing. So there's a lot to take in, and also, I think we need this realm today without our awareness into heaven, because as Swedenborg puts it, we tend to be selfish, and there was a time where our spiritual eyes were opened, and that was appropriate for us. But as we tend to be materialist and selfish now, that's kind of closed off for good reason, I guess, according to him at least. Hinduism calls this world Maya, which means illusion. That's a beautiful reflection, Robert, that often everything we see is an appearance of truth, and this world specifically is this external manifestation of deeper truth. So if we take everything at face value, like everything's literal, that's all there is, we're kind of missing how our brains work, how language works, how the holographic universe works even. And really missing the meaning, because it goes deeper than the surface, right? And as you put it, it's an illusion in a sense. You also share in Moses, Akhenaten Nefertiti, his wife system is the soul as female and male as ego. His wife system is the soul as female and male as ego. Well, I know men are typically filled with ego. No, I'm kidding. I want to learn more about that. Share some of what you mean. That's good. Thank you for sharing, Robert. And with that, I want to uplift your spirit this evening in community. Hopefully you're ahead of the game, willing to reflect on your heart, willing to change for the better. Hopefully we're all there, no matter our traditions and our religions. And as Swedenborg said, and I'll re-emphasize this because he didn't talk as much about it this time, he saw heaven as full of people from many different religions, and all being part of this divine body, receiving all that they have from divinity and acknowledging it, but each being different in their own right, connecting, growing forever. And then that's the point of the universe. That's why God created this universe, is to have this community, to have this place of joy, so that divinity could share her divinity, her joy, her connectedness with us. And I think that that is a wonderful message. Even if you don't quite believe it, I think it's beautiful. Something we can say is nice. And with that, I want to wish you a beautiful week, and go forth knowing that you are quite loved.